All right. It looks like it's time for us to get started. So I want to welcome everybody again to this webinar on advancing geographies of justice by removing offensive place names. And I want to welcome you on behalf of not just myself, but also the organizations I'm representing. I'm the director of the California Geographic Alliance, but also proud to welcome you on behalf of the California Global Education Project, the California Subject Matter Project, and the National Council for Geographic Education. I'm involved in one way or another with all of those organizations, and my motivation, my kind of through line, is that I'm interested in supporting high quality geography education through collaboration with educators and education leaders at all levels. And so the program that we're about to jump into is an example of that collaboration. So just by attending, I feel like I'm collaborating with all of the educators and future educators who are here today. So I want to thank you for joining me. I'll stop sharing for a second. Coming to you from my California Geographic Alliance remote learning outpost here in San Diego, California. And I'm joined by a panelist, Derek Alderman, who's been kind enough to contribute to this webinar. He's going to be sharing a lot later on as we get into the content. But anyway, I will just repeat the link I shared. I'm not sure everybody can see it, but you can access the slides and a page of resources and activities that I put together for the webinar there. And I'm going to go back into screen sharing. And we've got a pretty full slate of material to get to in an hour. So I'm going to jump right into it. We are getting an early start on Geography Awareness Week. So I want to make sure to put a plug in for the week that it starts officially on November 18th. But we're getting into it right now, and I think you'll find that the content of this webinar embraces this year's theme of geographers take action. So I'm a geographer, Dr. Alderman's a geographer, and hopefully we're not just going to share action we're taking, but inspire you to take action using some geographic inquiry tools. So just some quick notes on the content and the agenda for the webinar. Really, it's three components that we're trying to cover. First of all, we want to get into this topic of offensive place names. It's a topic that I imagine a lot of you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about or kind of engaged with. So we want to get into the topic, become aware, prepare ourselves to act in response to what we're learning. And it can be a challenging topic. I generally try on my own not to repeat words I regard as slurs. But I've been encouraged that we have to confront the issue if we're going to change it. So with us being educators, earlier in the day we did a webinar with students included. I'm going to be a little less concerned about using terms knowing that we can repeat the language in the spirit of confronting and counteracting it. For example, just going back to the image I used in the flyer for the webinar or in the title screen, you'll notice I've blocked some words out that just offended me as official signs. And then there's also signs by people protesting what's on the official signs. And I certainly wouldn't want to try to silence those people or interfere with their use of that term to counteract its offensive use as a place name. So that's kind of the spirit we're going to use in this evening's webinar, or this afternoon's webinar. We're going to benefit from a conversation with two scholars that are taking action to address this problem. One of whom you just saw briefly on the screen, another who was with us earlier but lives in Spain, so is probably comfortably in bed at this hour. And so we'll see this conversation that we had largely on video, but you'll have opportunities to ask questions. And the goal then, number three, is not just to be part of this webinar, but to kind of launch into your own inquiry arc with opportunities to collect information, engage with your community, and take action. So please do use the Q&A feature of Zoom liberally. I'll keep an eye on it. I'm flying solo as a Zoom host, so I'll do my best. Apologies in advance for any technical glitches. So just a word about me as a person interested in this topic, and just kind of accounting for my own experiences and positionality. And I encourage anyone approaching a topic that's going to affect different people in different ways to kind of take the same approach of self-reflection. You've probably gathered from the image on the screen that I'm part of a dominant culture in the United States as a white man of European heritage, but I've got some personal experiences you couldn't tell by looking at me. So after growing up in Wisconsin and New Jersey, I actually moved with my family to Washington, D.C. So I had the experience of living in a majority Black city, and I actually graduated from a high school that was over 90% Black. So that was a unique, I mean, it was a big life shift, but a unique experience being part of a minority group and observing a different culture and a different way of relating to the landscape there in the city where I was new in so many ways. After getting a bachelor's degree in geography in Villanova University, I moved to New Mexico in 1991. And that was another big shift, a culture shock, possibly is the right term. In New Mexico, I learned about border regions. I experienced Latin and indigenous cultures for the first time significantly. And academically, I got involved as a geographer, and scholarship focused on public lands management and specifically wilderness planning. So I went to this place here, Ancha Wilderness, gorgeous spot in the Tonto National Forest in Arizona, and piloted a wilderness management plan, an approach. And you'll see there on the screen, I just clipped the first few trail names. I covered every trail in this wilderness area and assessed its content. And one of the things I learned is that there was, a legacy of offensive place names kind of lingering out there on public lands, maybe in plain sight, but not getting noticed that often. With some regret, I look back on that and think I didn't raise any objection or even write up in my reports that I submitted that perhaps this should be looked at. So fast forwarding in my life, 1993, I moved to San Diego to further pursue studies in geography at San Diego State. I ended up taking a big turn in terms of what I studied academically, and partially because I had the experience of living in this neighborhood of City Heights in San Diego, a place I could afford as a graduate student on a graduate student salary. But it became a place that's been still home to me. It's where the remote learning facility is, actually, and it's a place that I've actually focused my academic research on something nobody was doing at the time, which was looking at children's everyday geographic experiences. How did they navigate and experience and relate to the neighborhood? So I learned to try as best as possible to use my skills in critical thinking and observation to appreciate what other people were seeing and doing with the landscapes where we had shared life experiences. So that's me, and so you get the idea that I knew something about this issue from my personal experiences. But when I moved to San Diego, I learned about a specific story that I want to share that I think is part of why all the years later I decided to do this webinar. So what got my attention about this story wasn't actually the interesting story I'm going to share right now about this amazing individual. It's the fact that there was a story about offensive place names that were attached to that individual story. And so I learned about the offensive place names and was shocked by them, and only later learned about the person these names were kind of associated with. So I put this link to this page from the Homestead National Historical Park in the resources guide. Nathan Harrison is a person who's kind of an amazing American individual in the sense of how he was involved in so many different historic events. So he was an enslaved person in Kentucky that was brought by his enslaver to California to participate in the California Gold Rush. He finally got his freedom. You might be adjusting your appreciation of California as a free state, so to speak, because he didn't get his freedom until his enslaver died. He subsequently came down to San Diego County and filed a homestead claim and got a homestead, actually two. And he's kind of like a Forrest Gump of San Diego County. He was present in all of these local historic events and is in fact even a tourism pioneer. He's regarded as the most photographed resident of San Diego from the 19th century. So not the founder of the city, not other people who are associated with landmarks in the city. It's this former slave who homesteaded at the kind of foot of a mountain that became a popular place for outdoor recreation. And when people began traveling into Nathan Harrison's backyard, what he did is he opened up his house and offered water for boiling over radiators as early cars climbed up the mountain, and water for the passengers. And he would also tell them stories about his life in these historical, epic experiences. And so lots of people knew about Nathan Harrison. And how did they commemorate this, significant, well-known San Diegan? They named the places where he lived after him. And what I'm showing you on the screen right now is a United States Geological Survey map from 1939 that I accessed from the link that's active on the bottom of the slide. It allows you to look through historic topographic maps of a location where you live. So you might find a discovery like this, that the spot where Nathan Harrison's homestead was located and the road that people traveled up and stopped along to visit with him both got the N-word attached to them. Now this is a 1939 map. I went back and looked at a 1903 map and found the same word being used to name the canyon. Now, in 1903, that's where Nathan Harrison was living and greeting people. He did not die till 1920. So this is contrary to naming conventions I've read about. This is not a case of a person passing away and then naming a spot after him. This was done while he was still alive. Now, fast forward to a 1997 map of the same area, and you can see this particular offense has been corrected, and the canyon's been renamed Harrison Canyon. This actually was done in 1959. So while there's a long legacy and history of offensive place names, there's also a story to be told about the progress that's being made. Here in California, we have a state initiative that's looking at the state parks and state property and going through and making changes and recommending more inclusive reflections on California history. And we can also see our state's California Advisory Committee on Geographic Names, and there's something like this in every state, that's actively reviewing proposals for name changes. Many of them to replace offensive names, names that citizens or advocacy groups have identified as offensive, and in some cases to add new names that are more inclusive and more reflective of the population of the state. So there is that going on. And again, there's links here that you can get to through the slides for more information. And so as a person that knew something about this, but was curious enough to want to know more, back in August, I found myself reading this online article from The Conversation, a great online publication. And I was interested. And then I was also inspired by what I read, because what I read was that a really common sense approach was being used to help identify and respond to instances where offensive place names still were in place. And the problem wasn't resolved as much as I had hoped. That might be the case, that without any action, the problem would resolve itself, right? This is something we often hope for, but it doesn't often work out like that. If we have a problem, we often have to take some action to fully resolve it. So I was really heartened by what I read in this article, and I reached out to the lead author, Dr. Alderman, because he's somebody I've interacted with through professional circles, and he recommended that not only did he agree to be part of this webinar, but he was fairly insistent that we needed to reach out to his colleague, Dr. Otto Perales, who had actually done some important work that had caught my attention. So we're going to learn more about that. Mostly what we did is we did an interview. I told you about our time difference challenge with one person in California, one in Tennessee, and one in Spain. So we did an interview before this, and I chopped up that interview in bits so that we could fit it into an hour. And so you're going to be seeing interview excerpts. So before I get to that, though, I know Dr. Alderman is here. You've seen him, so I'm going to give him a moment to unmute and just say hello.
Hi, everybody. And Tom, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for allowing me to be part of it. And I can't see anyone, but I'm very happy to know everyone's here.
Thank you, thank you. I did resolve one problem, so Dr. Alderman's to be congratulated for doing this twice in one day, and these are my first and second experiences using Zoom webinar, which turns out is not quite exactly like a Zoom meeting, which I'm in 1,000 times over. So I'm learning some things. I did manage to get Dr. Alderman's camera on, but the rest of the participants I kind of power muted and cameras forced off, I think for bandwidth purposes. But we do have 41 people joining, and so we're very appreciative of that. Okay, so to get into the content, and I agree, thank you for presenting. We are, let's see if I can make this work this time. We're going to see in the first part of the interview, we're going to hear from Dr. Alderman. And so I wanted to make sure to put a slide in here with a link to his personal website so you could see more about his scholarship. You're just going to hear little snippets right now, but you can look into what he's been doing around place names and the honoring of legacies of the civil rights movement and landscapes and place names and things that are very important and go beyond just the scope of this webinar. So we're going to check out the first segment of the interview now. I want to welcome both of you and thank you for taking time to share about your important work. In this conversation, I will first turn to Derek Alderman, who's a prominent figure in American geography as a result of his research and his service to multiple causes and organizations. He studies the American South as a cultural region and investigates intersecting topics of public memory and heritage landscapes, mobility and travel, social justice, and race relations in that region and in our country more broadly. Dr. Alderman is a professor of geography at the University of Tennessee, a former president of the American Association of Geographers, and someone who contributes substantially to the ongoing effort to advocate for high-quality geography education for all American students. I particularly appreciate Dr. Alderman's public scholarship and his willingness to share academic research with a non-academic audience. In 2022, Derek was appointed by Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland to serve on the Federal Advisory Committee on Reconciliation and Place Names, U.S. Department of the Interior. He is, in fact, the lead co-author of the committee's place name reconciliation principles. That's pretty impressive. Derek, I'd love to start by hearing about how you became interested in the subject of geography enough to pursue a PhD in the field, and specifically how your own life experiences shape the interests and types of questions that are at the core of your scholarship.
Well, thanks, Tom. Right at this point, I'll share my screen. Tom, thanks for that really nice introduction and for the chance to be part of this. I did not know that geography was a major field of study until I got into college for my undergraduate degree at Georgia Southern University. I was a history major. I took my first college level geography course to fulfill a general education requirement. I really just sort of accidentally got into geography, but I had a great college teacher, mentor in Dr. Daniel Good, and he quickly helped me fall in love with the field of geography. And I think that's important because many of our stories are not just about the field itself, but about the people that we interact with, that we connect with. I guess as a kid, I always had a gut feeling that place was important, sense of place was important to people. But it was Dr. Good who really, who's pictured here in this slide, that pushed me to explore these issues in a lot deeper, more creative ways. And the vision of geography that Daniel Good gave to me was a field engaged with communities. It was a field that was addressing social and environmental issues, and it was a field that was devoted to public-facing scholarship. And that vision has really become part of my academic DNA. Uh, you know, Dan Good was of a different generation than I am, or some of us here on this Zoom. But and he didn't really use these words exactly, but he taught me what's now probably called a place-based ethics of care. And what he was getting at was that he saw an intimate relationship between people and place. And he recognized in many, I think, important ways that places have critical consequences for people. They have critical consequences for their well-being, that places are important to one's sense of belonging. And at the heart of this ethics of care, and I've tried to illustrate here on this slide, is that places are often made in ways that can ignore, control, or even wound or harm historically marginalized people. In other words, places can be a source of inequality and discrimination. But it's also possible, and this is the exciting part to me, it's also possible for places to be made in ways that give voice and opportunity and respect to those same discriminated groups. In other words, places can be a source of empowerment and a source of social change. And I think another dimension of this place-based ethics of care that has really driven a lot of my work and my interest in geography is the fact that geographers, they don't just study places. Traditionally, maybe geographers thought that that's what they do, but really now geographers don't just study places. Geographers can and should help make places more equitable, more healthy, more sustainable. In other words, it's the role of geographer to play to play an important impact in terms of building a better future. And so geography is a field of action. I'm proud to say that. And as someone who's been involved in the field for quite a while, I see so many of my colleagues illustrating this every day. Geographers have a responsibility to turn their scholarship, their professional work, their teaching, just their community engagement into what we call actionable knowledge. And what I mean by actionable knowledge is that it's when we use geographic information and resources to inform community debates, um, educate the media, advance inclusive policy, such as place name policy, street naming decisions could be examples. And so if you think about it, I think where I would love to see, I think where my own education has moved and where I would like to see more education moving, and I think it is towards this place-based ethics of care. And it's been those very questions of place and ethics and care that's driven a lot of my work. It's pushed me to think about asking questions about who gets to create places, whose worldviews and experiences are written into or out of those places. And how do we name places in ways that in fact either care for people or care for other differences and diversity, or in fact ignore those differences and that diversity.
Okay, that's an excellent start. We have a similar story in that neither of us who current PhD holders in geography knew anything about the subject until we found ourselves in front of an instructor who could explain the topic at college and get us interested. So that's an excellent kind of reason to be doing this, encouraging primary and secondary students to think about geography as an active field, not about memorizing place names, but about changing the places so that they're better habitats for us. All right, now I'm navigating a tricky issue with sharing. So this is my reason for killing a little moment here. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and the next part of the interview really gets into Dr. Alderman's role with the federal government in place names reconciliation. So I included a slide here that gives you a link to more information. You can get info on the composition and the responsibilities of the committee uh, on your own. And I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next segment of the interview.
And really, this is where it all started for me in terms of the study of place names and street names, and a lot of these issues of racial reconciliation and social justice is related to names. I first became interested in place name study while writing a doctoral dissertation at the University of Georgia on the renaming of streets after civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr. And at that point, those streets, which are now well known now, but at that point, those streets were still relatively new on the American landscape. And I was interested in sort of the typical geography questions of how many streets there were, where they're located, and what the presence of those streets told us about positive changes in race relations, as well as changes in the way America was willing to publicly remember Black history. And I did discover that those streets were important indicators of a growing political influence of African Americans within cities and towns. But what I also found, and this was probably the transformative moment for me as a place name scholar and a geographer, is I found that naming streets for Dr. King was very highly controversial, and that Black communities face significant obstacles in the naming process and in the struggle to remember King, um, not just generally, but to also figure out where best to remember King within those cities and those communities. White controlled city councils and county commissions, especially in the South where I was working at the time, often block proposals by Black communities to attach King's name to large commercial thoroughfares. And many Black communities wanted King's name up on these big major roads that would cut across traditional racial and economic boundaries. But what they ran into, and more times than not, is that many white residents, business owners, they bitterly opposed having their address identified with King. They were opposed with having their streets named for Dr. King, and because they interpreted it as being associated with the Black part of town, and the stigma that they attached to that, which was regrettable and tragic. And what I learned from that was, in fact, a very bitter irony. Was that much of America was celebrating a civil rights leader who battled inequality and racial divides by actually racially segregating his name and memory in disadvantaged African American neighborhoods. And it was a real turning point for my thinking about place naming, in the sense that it got me thinking about that sometimes you can't just rely upon what you see on the landscape or what you rely and see on a map or on a database of street names. You have to go and look into the history of the struggle behind that name and how it came to pass, how it came to be. And all of this work led me to discover and begin to contribute to a field of study that we call critical place name studies. And that is really the study that I've been trying to contribute to now for the last 25, 26 years of my career. All right, so I promised I wouldn't do this, but I did it anyway. I talked a lot about King Streets, and I'm sorry. But my work has still stays really interested in King Streets, but it's shifted and has expanded in many ways. And one of the things that I've become much more interested in lately is what I call America's place renaming moment. And what I mean by that is that we're seeing growing public interest well beyond naming streets for King, well beyond naming streets for Malcolm X or other figures. We're starting to see growing public interest in identifying challenging place names of all sorts, names that are offensive and oppressive to Black and indigenous communities, names that are offensive or oppressive to other people of color or women. Um, and there's a growing push in America right now, and I try to give you a few headlines here on the screen. There's a growing push in America right now to do dignity and justice to the nation's diversity. And these are taking place in communities of all sizes and shapes, where there are questions being asked about why that name is attached to this street. Why is that name attached to this park, to this school? Um, and it's led me really to devote a lot of my career to trying to do interventions in place name policy and education. And this is a little embarrassing because I've got a few slides on here that talk about me, and this really shouldn't be about me. But I want to give an example of how I think geographers can make a difference. In other words, they're putting themselves in positions where they're writing about and speaking about issues that can have a direct bearing on how communities see these issues and how they debate them. And so a lot of my work is about street names, but it also deals with the naming of schools, the naming of university buildings, the naming of businesses. Um, and it really pays attention to the fact that a lot of this work in terms of reaching out to and being important to communities isn't just in the traditional classroom, although it can happen there, but it's also about getting in front of city, county leaders. It's also about doing webinars like this or doing teach-ins. And so one of your questions, Tom, was how did I end up on this federal advisory committee? And there's sort of two answers to this. One, I had a very generous colleague who decided to nominate me, and I was very grateful for that. It was a geographer within our organization, the American Association of Geographers. But honestly, he told me that part of the reason he nominated me was that he thought a geographer should be in a position to inform public policy. And so he had confidence in me, but he also had a confidence in our field and a confidence in our discipline. Why else did I get on this committee? I think probably my work on looking at place naming and civil rights, my work with other public groups. I think that I think some of the things that I was trying to say and do within my own field mattered. But I will tell you in all sincerity that as much as it's a great honor and I feel really flattered and privileged to be on this committee, I have gotten more out of this committee than I have brought. So have I contributed a lot? I think I have, but I've gotten a heck of a lot out of this committee. I work with a fantastic group of scholars and advocates from a lot of different communities across the country. They're pictured here. We're in front of Devil's Tower, Bear Lodge, and we've been able to work together. I've learned a great deal about the place name needs of tribal nations, and learned about the place name needs of a lot of other communities. And I just want to leave us with that idea that, yeah, it's about sometimes what we know, but it's also about being open to learning and being taught and being educated. And so I come back to this one final point that for me to be a good geographer and to be a better geographer, yeah, it's about me engaging in my field, but it's also about me engaging with people who are already doing geography, even if they don't call themselves geographers.
All right, you can never go wrong putting a photo of Bear Lodge in a geography presentation, so well done. But also just that idea that geographers learn from people doing geography that don't call themselves geographers is a perfect transition to the next segment because we're oh, one of the things that makes me proud to be a geographer is not just the excellent things that geographers do that I appreciate that we're learning about, but the fact that geography as a way of thinking about the world is so helpful, is so productive in terms of assessing challenges and finding pathways forward to a better future. And so the next segment we're going to be hearing from Dr. Alderman's colleague, who is in fact not a geographer. So Dr. Otto Perales is an economist, and he's, as I mentioned, he's with the university in Spain, Universidad Pablo de Olavide, and he's also the founder of something called the Street Names Lab. That's how we pronounce that, Street Names Lab. And so he's doing something because he's interested in questions of, like Dr. Alderman, he's interested in questions of inequality and on the role of history and geography in shaping the way people understand themselves in the larger context of a society. So he's seeing geography and particularly street names and place names as a way to understand those relationships in society. So I'm going to jump ahead to the next segment, and we're going to hear from him about the way he's bringing data science into this area of thinking about place names. As we continue this conversation, I want to bring Daniel Otto Perales into this conversation. I'm sure he's going to bring additional perspective. He's also going to make this conversation span nearly halfway around the globe, as we've got California, Tennessee, and now Spain. Dr. Otto Perales is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the Universidad Pablo de Olavide in Sevilla, Spain. His research focuses on the fields of economic development, economic history, and economic geography, particularly on the role played by inequality in institutions in economic activity and welfare, paying special attention to the historical processes involved. So us history, social science educators in the U.S. will relate to his work on many levels. And I first learned about Dr. Otto Perales from this article, so I apologize to him that I can't give a more comprehensive introduction, but I assure you I'm paying attention to what you're doing now with the Street Name Labs, which is a project that brings a data science approach into the realm of street names and into name reconciliation. So that's a very different approach than many cultural geographers might use, but it's very effective and complementary. And I think this project is a powerful demonstration of how geography, data science, and computer applications can come together to create places that are the best possible reflections of ourselves. So, Daniel, without further ado, can you tell us more about the Street Names Lab, how it got started, and the kinds of projects you and the larger team have worked on so far, knowing that your entry into this topic is probably very different than Dr. Alderman's.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Tom, for organizing the webinar, for inviting me to participate. And I'm gonna share a screen. Okay. Okay, the Street Name Lab is a research team of social scientists, mainly, but not only, with an economic background, and that apply quantitative and computational tools to street name data. We got first interested in street names as a source of information for social and cultural values of city and towns, because typically information about the culture of cultural values come from national and regional surveys, but it's rarely available at the local level. We found in street names a way to measure this hard to find data. This is because the street name reflects the commemorative priorities of local communities. So the street name arguably reflect their social and cultural values. And naturally, this assumes that the street naming decisions are taken at the local level, as is generally the case. We have corroborated in several studies the usefulness of street names to capture the cultural values of local communities. For instance, in this paper, we show that an indicator of religiosity calculated from street name data is strongly correlated with the religiosity of the population measured through surveys. Here, for instance, we show that the population in provinces with a higher percentage of religious streets tend to attend more to religious services than the population of provinces with a lower percentage of religious streets. We show for other cultural and social dimension that the street names are related actually to social and cultural value. For example, for national identity and gender equality, we show a similar correlation. For instance, considering attitudes toward gender roles, we show that people living in towns with a greater proportion of female streets tend to have more egalitarian gender views, measured through survey questionnaires. This evidence that we show for Spain has been recently replicated for the case of Italy by other researchers. Related to the gender issue, we have conducted a project where we quantify the gender gap in street names. We create an algorithm to automatically classify all streets, all Spanish streets by their gender, if any, during the last 20 years. Once we did this, we developed several tools to help citizens and people in general, on the one hand, know how large and persistent is the gap in the gender gap in street name, and on the other, to help them monitor the progress toward equality in their towns. So now I'm gonna move to the street name LAT website. And here in application, we have the Gender Cities project. And we, for example, have this interactive figure in which we type the name of a town, for example, the main city of Spain, Madrid, the capital. And we can see the evolution of the proportion of women streets. The proportion of women streets in relation to the total number of streets named after people. So we see that first, that the proportion is low, is only 17% in 2001, and has slightly increased until 18% in 2022. For example, we can check Barcelona, the second largest city in Spain, and we see that in Barcelona, the percentage is much lower. Is nowadays about 12%. So we can check the progress in gender equality in this dimension for every town in Spain. And this resource we think is useful for social movement, and is an increasing attention being paid to more equality in the street scale. Okay, and we also, for example, have this map in which we show the percentage of female streets across provinces, and also we zoom in a province, we see the percentage across town in an across city within the province, and also we zoom in, we see the distribution of female and male streets within a city. And we typically see in cities that the proportion, the presence of female streets is more frequent in the periphery, in part because it is easier for local authorities to name new streets than to rename existing ones. Well, we have also created street name search apps for North America, for Spain, for Europe. And these apps enable users to find and download street name data, which may be useful for many purposes. One of them is the topic of this seminar, that is the search for discriminatory and offensive road names. Okay, so this is some of the work we have done in recent years, and I think it's enough to get some idea of what we do.
Okay, so we've transitioned from the more general subject of place names to the more specific topic of street names. And just for emphasis, I want to go back to something Daniel said there, that street names are mostly determined by local authorities, and therefore they reflect or should reflect local cultural values. And maybe that's a great thesis statement for why street names are a great place for students to start with addressing this larger problem of offensive place names. And so there's a tool here I can keep my slides under control. The last part of the interview I'm going to play is Daniel sharing kind of his live use of the North American Street Names app, which we hope you will use to learn about streets in your community. So I'm going to go ahead and get that started, and then we'll take questions at the end, and we'll see what people think about digging into some inquiry regarding their own area. I think you talked about this a little bit, but as I mentioned, we're going to direct folks to using the North American Street Names app, although certainly exploring other parts of the website as well. But can you say more about how it works from the design side, how you get the large volumes of street name data that are really the power of the app, and then also how you've envisioned people using the app, just citizens or other scholars, anybody that you had in mind as this app was being designed?
Well, starting by the last question, I think Derek for sure thinks the same, that the street names attract a lot of interest by the public, by journalists, by people in general. Street names don't go unnoticed, and there are a lot of news about the street name every day. There's a lot of controversy because it's as a symbolic policy. Street names generate very charged debates, and people needs this data, and we thought that there was no app or no way for a non-expert researcher or for a non-expert user to get the street name data, and we thought about this and about making an app easily accessible to people without a computational and technical background. So, well, going to the North American Street Name app, we get the data from OpenStreetMap, which is a quite comprehensible source of toponyms and includes all roads named in the US and in most of the countries around the world. Okay. Once we get the data, we process it, and to minimize the cases of duplicated streets, and we also remove a street without names or a street that just contain numbers or symbols that are not interesting to us. This gives us for the US, just for the US, this gives us 7 million streets. So our database is 7 million streets. So this is a large database. Then we extract the coordinate of which streets, so the user can later on get this coordinate. And we also overlap the geographic layer of the street with other geographic layer of administrative boundaries, cities, counties, and states. So the North American app includes Canada, Mexico, and the United States. We focus on the United States. We can perform queries for particular states, 1 or 2 or 3 particular states, or for the whole United States. If we do the last thing, it takes longer because this is a query in a data set of 7 million streets, so it takes a bit longer. And for a particular state is much faster. So, for example, for California, we can enter in a query, we can enter 1 or more terms or names separated by a semicolon. We can write a full name or word or part of a word followed by an asterisk or with an asterisk before. For example, if we do this query for California, for example, we write type row. This is a query for all streets in California with that contains a word starting with row. And we see that there are a lot of streets containing a word that start with row. But but we can, so this is, you can see the functionality of the asterisk. If we just want to check street containing the term Robert, we get 94 streets. Okay, so let's, for example, do a query that's the Professor Derek talked before about the civil rights movement and Confederate memorials being removed or in the process of trying to be removed. So let's check, for example, in Texas, for the Confederate General Robert Edward Lee. Okay. So if we want to make a query to get the street named after Robert Edward Lee, it's better if we type different forms of this name. For example, Robert E. Lee, or simply Robert Lee. And we submit the query, and we get that we have in Texas 15 streets named after the Confederate General Robert Lee. We can, the results are reported in an interactive map. We can zoom in to see the location of the city, and we can download the data by streets. So the result of the queries, we can download it by streets or group at the county level. So if we are interested in counting how many streets are in each county, so we download the data at the county level. If we want to know the location, or we want to get a list of all the streets from the query, so we download the data by street. For example, let's download the data to see what we get. We get this Excel file in which we have a sheet with the result of the query, the street names, and interestingly, the location. And this is interesting because we can check this precise location in other apps, for example, in Google Maps. If we go to Google Maps, I have Google Maps open here, and we, for example, look at this street in San Antonio. We simply copy the coordinates, latitude and longitude coordinates. We go here, we paste here, and we search. And well, we have here the street, the Robert Lee Street in San Antonio. And we, for example, if we have a list of streets and we want to get additional data, because it's just not counting the number of streets, also the characteristics of the streets are important. We can here create additional columns and to include, for example, the length of the street. We can calculate the length of the street with Google Maps. This street has 723 meters. We can type here this information, and we can also see the location, the type of street, the type or the type of neighborhood. Okay, we can go to Google Streets, and we can see the neighborhood. We can see whether there is a street sign, or the information that contains the street sign. Now we go here to the intersection, and we see that there is a street sign, and indeed this is a street named after Robert E. Lee, or Edward Lee. Okay, so
that's outstanding. Thank you so much for doing the live demo of the functionality, because that's really helpful for people to see how that works. It's simple, but of course, if you don't know, you don't know the next step, you can get stuck. And so I'll just mention that CSV file that you save, the Excel file, same thing if teachers or students are using Esri's ArcGIS online, that's the same type of file that they could import there. I also appreciated the idea that you could generate a metric, for example, the meters or feet of street that are carrying this name. And you showed how to query textual data, that you have to think about the different formats it could use the wildcards, because as you zoomed into Robert E. Lee Street on in San Antonio there, I couldn't help notice that the next street above it was Lee Street.
Yes,
And I
I
thought,
noticed this before, but why just
yeah.
yeah.
And then you have, so sometimes it's really obvious what's happening because the whole name is there. And sometimes you have to think, well, I don't know if Lee Street is referencing that Lee. But sometimes you can find out in the official records. And also the date. All right. Sorry for the abrupt cutoff, but I recognize we're getting close to the appointed hour, and so you get the idea there. And I do want to let you know that you have access to the full interview, so you can learn more about a variety of topics. The point I would highlight coming out of that segment is that people do need data and evidence to understand the world around them and get to that informed action that Derek talked about earlier. And so a federal or a state committee with official responsibilities needs to know that those names are out there and to know that people want them changed. And at a local level, if we're thinking about those street names, they might have less resources to gather that information. So the role of a citizen advocacy group could be even greater. So that's something to think about. And as we get through to the last part of our webinar here. I'm not seeing any questions, but don't be shy about asking questions. As I mentioned, you can get to the full length interview and learn about some other topics. I tried to bring a little bit of it into the chat while we were moving along. But if there's questions or feedback, we have a moment here. So Morgan's asking about past derogatory names with natural geographic locations. Do you think those names may have influenced the labeling or categorizing of wildlife in those areas? Oh, like a transference of a problematic name. I don't know of any cases of that, but that's an interesting question.
Hey, Tom, if I could break in here, one of the
Yeah, please
things
do.
it is interesting, and I don't know if it's directly tied to the name of the place where you find the wildlife, but we are starting to see a great deal of debate about the names that we have historically used to label and characterize certain species of plants and animals. Whether it's naming a plant or animal after a racist historical figure, or if it's using some derogatory slur in reference to an organism.
Yeah, and I know my local membership to what used to be the San Diego Audubon Society is now the San Diego Bird Society. There's a general movement away from using people's names to name natural features or species. So that it just brings up something we discussed in the interview in the longer version is just drawing that line between what is offensive and what isn't offensive. It's going to be different for different people and it's going to change over time. And that's something to be explored and a way to adjust the ways in which our local places do reflect our cultural values. So a question from Scott that I think you can see there, Derek, about how street names, at least in the US, are decided and what needs to happen for them to be changed.
Yeah, so street names are particularly problematic in terms of changing. One would think that it would be relatively simple. It's just about removing a name, changing street signs, changing some maps. But people often have a very intense identification and loyalty to the names of their roads, coupled with the fact that cities are increasingly passing policies that make it tougher and tougher to rename a road. In fact, I ran into this when I was studying streets named for Dr. King, is that it's not out of the ordinary to find a city or a county that will say, you can't rename the name of a road, however horrific the name is. If you can't get 50%, 75%, sometimes 100% of property owners on that road to agree to it. So to actually affect collective change requires actually to be collective. It requires to get a lot of people on the same page, which can be very difficult to do in cities that are bifurcated by neighborhoods and divided interests and loyalties.
And I see Renee contributing a comment here that there actually are some examples she knows of tree species where the term was considered derogatory and removed. So thanks for contributing that. And I think we've gotten to those items. So just to recap, this isn't just a learn and go back to your regular life. There's an opportunity here to keep going with learning and action. So with the resources we provided, you can read more about this issue. You're going to find some amazing examples of both offense and reconciliation. So you can learn about that. You can get motivated to use the tools for research and action that are included there, and think about what those pathways to reconciliation are. Usually that's not a pathway to reconciliation isn't something that you do individually as a lone advocate. You do that as part of a community that wants to change the relationships, that wants to make sure that the community is reflecting cultural values. Then, there's some questions on that activity sheet that I think could guide some personal reflection, but also some critical conversations so that you can reflect on what you've experienced in your life and the potential biases that you might have experienced because your identity or the places where you've lived. And you can also learn from open discussions with others and take their experiences as significant and informative so that you can better understand the issues. And then you can collect information at a local level about your community, raise awareness among other people, and start to think about what informed action looks like towards those pathways for reconciliation. So that's all very important. I also want to encourage you on Geography Awareness Week to just keep thinking about how you can learn more about what geography really looks like. So if you're in a state outside of California, you can look into whether your state has a Geography Education Alliance or another group that promotes geography education and shares resources. Or you could consider joining the National Council for Geographic Education for students. And I know there's a lot of pre-service teachers who are students right now. It's only $25. And the conference in October 2025 is going to be in Omaha, Nebraska. You could continue learning about geography and geography education. So with that, I want to wrap up the formal webinar portion. I respect everybody's time, and I want to sincerely thank Dr. Alderman for all he's done to contribute to this webinar. But beyond that, the only reason we have a webinar to have is because of the work that you and your colleagues have done before that. That was a story worth telling. So I hope everybody appreciated that.
Well, Thomas, and I always call him Thomas, but Dr. Herman and Alderman, I just wanted to say thank you. I think all this information is so fascinating. I think I teach 4th grade and my kids were really excited about it. A lot of it was kind of over their head a little bit, but they were so excited. They're super excited to go and find out in their local little rural town what the streets are named after, because we've been learning about native land. So I think this really ties into it. And for me, the experience I've had in the small city of Chico is we did a few years ago, who's my pastor now, he created a coalition called Love Chapman, and we were able to change. It took 10 years and a lot of getting signatures and going in front of city council, but we did change one of our streets, one of our main roads, and to Martin Luther King Jr. Parkway. And we also were able to put in a statue of Martin Luther King to represent most of the community, because it's the area where it's at, it's the low housing area. A little town, a little spot called Chapman Town. And so it does take a lot of battle, but I think what we need to take away from this and also teach our students is, just like all of our great leaders, it's going to take a lot of obstacles, but if it's something that you truly want to see change, you have to keep fighting until that change does happen.
Well, thanks very much for those kind words. And it sounds like you are doing some terrific things in your community as well as your classroom. So my admiration to you. What's really interesting about students is that a lot of the really intense, meaningful place renaming campaigns are being led directly by students of all ages, elementary, middle school, high school, college. And they often lead off those campaigns by studying the actual data, studying the geography of the names within their communities. And they come to city council meetings fully loaded with those maps, with those data. And it's quite inspiring. And in fact, I've advocated on the federal advisory committee that I sit on that one of our goals is to develop a new generation, which I think it's already developing, a new generation of citizen place name scholars, who aren't just a bunch of eggheads like me, but they're actually, applying these ideas to the places where they live, work, and go to church, whatever it may be the case.
Yeah, this app that has been developed really brings citizen science into the realm of place name reconciliation and place name advocacy. So I really appreciate that. And I also want to thank Blanca for bringing your students into the conversation, because I mentioned earlier that I researched kids that were in 4th through 7th grade, and I actually hired them as photojournalists and told them I needed them to bring me the inside story of what it was like to be a kid living in their neighborhood. And they had very sophisticated things to say, and they understood some of the challenges and issues of their community so well that they were, in fact, able to explain to me the ways in which they sheltered their parents from concerning information about the neighborhood. So sometimes it's important to bring those barriers down and say that I don't know if this is over their heads, but it's an important conversation for them to know about and have a voice in. And what Derek said is true. They can be really strong advocates because they can speak with a really clear mind and bring the evidence and the question to a point.
Hey, Tom, if
Yeah.
I'm sort of a chatterbox, I guess it's late in the day and I've got no constraints or restraints. But I do want to tell you how much I really admire what you've done here and really have appreciated you reaching out. And I think you put together, my bit aside, I think you've really put together a nice product here and a nice tool that could be helpful. I will tell the group that I just got an email right before logging on to here that I and the rest of the Federal Advisory Committee have been reappointed to that advisory committee. I do not know how much longer that advisory committee has a life with the change in administration. And obviously, these issues go against the grain of some parts of that administration in a very intense way. But nonetheless, I will tell you that at least for the time being, for the remainder of this and getting into January, that committee and its subcommittees will be actively working right up until the point in which we're yanked, which I'm pretty sure we will be yanked and removed and disbanded.
Well, good to know that the reappointment came through and there's time to get something done, hopefully. Blanca, is your hand up? And
Yeah, I
okay,
put it up
go
because
for
I
it.
had a question for Dr. Alderman. So I know your committee, do they just work on renaming streets, or because I know with the new legislation of schools where they're having, I know my school's facing that right now, the high school, where they have to change their mascot, where they're called the Braves, and so now the superintendent kind of put it out there. And the only good thing to that is I think that has been a discussion for a really long time, is they're actually giving students a voice to be able to think of another mascot. Because some people are very adamant. We're the Braves. We've represented really well. We've never discriminated on anybody, but I don't think they see the underlining of the Native American, and we don't have a large Native American population in our little rural community, in that rural community. But is your committee going to be involved with that? Because I think it was 2030 is when it's going to be, where all schools are going to have to do that if it's an offensive mascot.
Yeah, so thank you again for the very insightful comments. We talk a great deal about school names and street names and a lot of other nomenclature. But our charge by Secretary Holland, who has been, I think, in my view, a fantastic leader, and it was a great honor to meet her. And it's like meeting a rock star. Our charge is to address names that are on federal lands, which tend to be physical, natural, geographic features. There are some human-made features, but it doesn't really deal with the street names that I've traditionally studied. It doesn't deal with the school names. But I think what you're picking up on is that committee is part of a more larger movement, a groundswell of movement that is trying to ask hard questions about mascots and names and associations. And so while we don't have a direct recommendation power in terms of those streets and schools that you're mentioning, I think a lot of our ideas, our principles, will keep informing, my hope is, will keep informing some of these struggles that are more local, state, county level that you're referring to.
And if I can add, just from my limited learning that I've done in prepping for this webinar, I understand, and I heard you mention that some states are taking more steps at a state level to block local authorities from changing names. At the same level in a state like California, and as Blanca's example shares, the state is taking more initiative in promoting or requiring change to occur at local level. So there's going to be different stories in different places regarding that. But also, I think the really important thing that I'm taking away from this is that there's going to be around the margins things that aren't getting done. That at the local level, there's still things to look at and to advocate for. I know, for example, I read all these articles about our state law that outlawed the use of the word squaw. That's featured in the title slide. And I right away plugged that into the North American Street Names app for California and found 14 or 17 instances of it coming up there. So it's not instantaneous. There's not a unanimous agreement that the change should be made. And so some of the articles that I linked talk about the resistance to and the community pushback that's happening when people find out that a place that they've lived is changing its name. Or there's one right now in California, a town named Kelseyville, that there's a petition to change the name. And I don't know the story with it, but I also learned about Downey, California, a significant Los Angeles area city, and Kern County, a county of the state of California, both named after people who have documented responsibility for indigenous massacres and displacement, extra legal displacement of California Native groups. So there's not only the need to enforce the rules that have been made, but there's a need to continue to look at, like Daniel talked about in Spain, the legacy of the Franco regime, and the fact that there's an imprint on the landscape that needs to be identified and removed unless people want to allow that to continue to reflect local cultural values. So if we don't want those to be the values, we have to change those names.
Yeah, Tom, and I think you're hitting on a very important theme, and I would go even one step further, that in addition to the fact that we see an unevenness, a geographic, social unevenness in terms of whether states are willing to engage in these important studies and different complex decisions about removing offensive names, we have at that same moment the building up of what I've been calling a place naming or place renaming backlash, where in fact, in some places, they are actually moving back to the original offensive derogatory name as a form of resistance to sort of the more progressive efforts to remove that name. Shenandoah County, which was in the news a great deal over the summer, which during the Black Lives Matter movement had removed the names of 3 Confederate generals from their schools. And just this earlier this summer, they put those Confederate generals back on the names of those schools. And it was in essence a snub. It was absolutely a backlash to what they saw was a change that they did not support as a community, or they felt like was too woke, was the word that was often used. Unfortunately, that word woke has been hijacked, along with a lot of other progressive words.
That just underscores the fact that so much of the characteristics of the places we live. So place names is one aspect, but the utilization of the space, the investment in improvements or in infrastructure, that is contested, and it reflects the powers of different groups of people to mobilize government to act on its behalf. And so it's the work's not done ever. I have a t-shirt I got from the Mikveh Challenge that says democracy is a verb. And so I wear it every now and then when it feels necessary, because you can't set something and then walk away from it and assume it'll stay. In a democratic society, that there's going to be another group raising its voice and becoming aware of something else. So whatever labels it gets on, it's civic rights and responsibilities, and it's everybody has to take a role in it.